in the sense that actually, as I've been doing it, I've been realizing quite how relevant this is, and I'm now really passionate about sharing it, and just helping people to understand the interconnection between the two concepts. So there's a lot of work on integrated care, and we all kind of think we know it, although that's a conversation in its own right, and the same on professional identity. But what we're realizing is that there's a really important link between the two. So when I talk about integrated care, it can apply to any multi-professional team or any team where people are working with people who come from different professional backgrounds to themselves. And it's basically looking at what happens to our professional identity in that scenario and what impact that then has on the way that we work with our multi-professional colleagues. So I think it's really important for team development when we start to think, you know, most teams we work in have some kind of impact from other professional backgrounds. So it's really important to look at what's happening to our identity within these teams. So I'm just going to try and share a couple of slides with you. So just bear with me a second while I get them up. I'm going to try and do it in such a way so that I can actually see what's happening in teams in the background. So just give me a second or two, and I'll share with you what we're going to do today, and hopefully this will make some sense to you. So it's just loading in the background. I've had great fun with my network in the last few days. This is just what you need, isn't it?
It's all right, Fiona. Mine was quite slow as well to come up.
Just love it, like preparing the slides.
Fill the gap between.
Absolutely. Can everybody see that? Yeah, brilliant. So superb. So basically what I want to cover is what professional identity is and how we identify in groups and why we do that, and then consider the interconnection really between the professional identity and multi-professional groups. And then I guess possibly what the most important part of it is what is the leadership challenge, because I do think there is a real challenge that we need to be more aware of and consider as we move forward. So is that what people are expecting of today? Does that sound pretty much what we all want to hear about? Yeah, I'll take the resounding silence as a yes. Excellent, brilliant, thumbs up, love it, superb, brilliant. So I'm just going to go through a few slides just to set the scene, and then I'll take them down and hopefully have a bit of discussion. So what I want to look at first of all is professional identity. Now, I don't know about you, but possibly you work in different worlds to what I do, and maybe this is something you've considered before, but certainly before I started my PhD, I possibly thought I knew what it was, but really didn't understand the concept or what the impact is really on our day-to-day working. So I'm just going to cover that really briefly. I mean, obviously identity is something we talk about a lot now, a lot more in everyday society, which I think is a really good thing. And we talk about, you know, how we identify as a person on a very personal level, but then actually, you know, humans are very social beings, and actually we need to identify as groups. We tend to lean towards groups. We lean towards people that are the same as us, and that actually becomes very much part of our identity. So whether that's on a personal level with, you know, the things that we like to do and the people that we like to be with, or whether that's on a professional level and actually our professional identity, so our background, where we come from, what our training is, the things that are familiar to us, and actually through a sort of process of reflexivity or reflection and self-awareness, we kind of look at our own actions and behaviours, and we look at the actions and behaviours of others, and then actually we feel like we identify with people that seem similar to us. And on a professional level, that's often with people that have the same professional training on same professional background to us. So it's very much about how we define ourselves within our work roles. So and what we know about professional identity is it is very social, that our workplace is a very social place, and actually in that social connection with other people we form that identity through that self-awareness. And what we are learning to understand is that this professional identity starts to form in our professional training. So for those of us, so I'm a nurse of background. I haven't worked clinically for a long time, but I'm still saying it. I still say I'm a nurse, and I feel slightly like a fraud because I haven't worked clinically for 10 years. But, you know, that's really important to me, that background, that identity that I have with my nursing colleagues. And I think for those of us who've come from a very profession specific background, maybe this can feel slightly stronger than for those of you who have maybe built up your professional expertise through a slightly longer route or through a maybe less well-known route. But what we do understand is that as we start our professional journey, wherever that might be, like in our early sort of career, that's where our professional identity starts to form. That's where we start to realize where we want to belong, who we belong with, the people that are similar to us, have the same kind of values and knowledge very early on in our career. But actually what we need to do, and I think this is the thing to remember, this is really key to what I'm going to try and tell you today, is our professional identity needs to be maintained. So it's highly social, we need to maintain it, we need to nurture it, is the word I like to use, because if we don't, it will have an impact on the way in which we feel, how we feel about ourselves, and the way in which we work within the workplace. And ultimately, it's about our self-esteem. It's about our self-esteem at work. So if our professional identity is threatened, or we don't feel secure, or we don't feel that we have the ability to nurture and maintain it, actually what happens is it actually has an impact on our self-esteem at work. And then, of course, it has a knock-on effect about the way we're going to work. So I just want to show you something else. This is about what we understand to be the attributes of professional identities. This is just Fitzgerald's view on it, but actually in all the studying I've done, actually it really does well sum up what professional identity is. So if you kind of look at that almost a little bit like a journey, it's almost the very early, the first couple of points in there is about our actions and our behaviours, like what we do when we're at work, and then what we know. So that's very much when you think about our early career, when we start to gain a lot of our professional knowledge. It's a kind of like, what do we do, what do we know, and who do we share that with? Who else out there has that same knowledge or similar knowledge and does a similar role to us? But then as you start to go through that, you then start to look at the way we internalize that. So that's around our values and our beliefs and our ethics, so that things that mean something to us, and it means something to us in a shared way across a profession. So if you take nursing, for example, you have things such as code of conduct. You know, it's very much about not just what we know and what we do, but why we do it, and those codes that really drive and underpin our daily work. But then you start to move into your context and your socialization. So it's about how you interact with your peers. Who else? So in my scenario, for example, as a nurse, you know, who are the other nurses? What, you know, how did they learn what they do? What are the things that drive them? What do we do within that social workplace? So is it a certain area, a certain specialism of nursing, for example? Or is it, you know, how do I interact with other nurses and get that context, to get that self-awareness, to get that reflexivity that then really helps me understand how I'm identifying. And then ultimately it's about, you know, for the more well-known professions, how are those professions recognised by society, but how do we as a person, how do we identify with that wider group? How does that become something that's important to us, and that's internal to us? So I guess, sorry, this slide here, why does professional identity matter to us? So when we start to think about what professional identity is, you know, we get it early on in our career, we start to form it, we need to nurture it, we need to maintain it. It's our sense of familiarity. It's the thing that makes sense to us, because these are people that are very similar to us, they have a very similar experience, and the things that we know, the things that we do are very similar. So therefore, it's a very familiar experience. But through that gives us a confidence in our role, because actually we're amongst like-minded people. There's other people out there that are similar to us, and that kind of gives you a bit of confidence, doesn't it? You're not standing out on a limb. But then through that, you then get this very positive self-esteem, because it, you know, we need people. We know as humans, we need other people to bolster our self-esteem, and that's no different in the workplace. And then that supports that really important psychological safety at work, that place where you feel safe at work because you've got the confidence, you have the self-esteem. And if you look at what the Centre of the Creative Leadership is saying, that actually, you know, that starts with a feeling of belonging, that belonging to the group. So before I go any further, does this make sense to you? Is this landing well with you? I'll be really interested to hear what you understand your professional identity to be, whether this is a concept you've really considered in any depth before. I mean, please feel free to come in and chat about it. I'll drop the slides, but yeah, Joanne, I think you've got your hand up.
I suppose I've been on a personal journey to sort of, especially around confidence and that sort of ability to speak up. I'm quite an introverted person, so some of the time I do a lot of consideration to be able to then speak up. But through that, I think I've maintained a level and got some credibility, but I've never thought of it in this formalized way. And I think this is really helpful, because it helps you frame it a little bit, and it gives you a little bit more, for me at least, it's starting to feel a bit more like I have got ownership of, and I have got a professional identity. I've not boxed it before, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think for the people who have a professional background that is very recognised and well known by society, it's maybe slightly easier. But for those of you who don't, it's maybe slightly harder, and therefore you possibly don't think, oh, it fits into a box, and maybe it doesn't need to fit into a box. I think what it is about that kind of internalization to say, I feel comfortable with these people because actually we share something. It's that shared knowledge. It's that when I have a conversation, even the language that I use, it makes sense to that person over there because actually we have a shared language. It's a shared way of doing things. And that's what gives you that confidence, like you said, that bolsters you and makes you kind of feel, yeah, I've got a bit of confidence. It helps your self-esteem within your role.
Yeah, my career is very much a mixed bag of lots of different things. So I'm not sort of one, like I said, I don't neatly fit into something, but you've made me think a little bit more about what I have got that gives me that credibility. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tyra.
Oh, thanks for this, Fiona. I think it's really interesting the way that you've contextualised this in terms of integration as well. So one of the things I guess I'm thinking about in terms of professional identity, and I get this a lot, especially in paramedicine, it's around, regulatory bodies, the scope of practice and what you can and can't do. And therefore, this isn't mine to do, this is yours to do. What that means for integration and dual registration as an example, or new scopes of practice. I think we're really interested to explore the role of regulatory bodies in establishing scope of practice and what that means for professional identity as well, and how that's restrictive for integration moving forward.
Yeah, really interesting. So actually, one of the things I'm going to talk about later on is not necessarily the role of regulatory bodies, but as we start to look at interconnecting roles within integration and what the risks are for integration and what the risks of integration are for professionals within their own roles, because actually, like you say, there's so much of that scope of practice that's shared in the middle, but where is a safe place to go, like safe practically, but also safe like psychologically, and what happens. And I think the role of regulatory bodies is really interesting because actually they can become very restrictive, and you can say actually it's very much about a power thing, isn't it? Although of course you'd still need safe practice.
So it's interesting what I see. So we've got a dual registration degree at the moment that's live with Edge Hill University. So it's where paramedics, you get dual registration paramedicine and also nursing. And I often get this conversation, which is, well, am I a nurse or am I a paramedic? Well, no, you're neither. It's a new scope of practice. So it's got a really interesting connotations for our future workforce, I think, in terms of professional identity.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think those people that feel more secure are able, and that's something I'll talk about later, are able to then to think about that, extending their scope of practice and moving into different realms. Those that feel more defensive and don't have that sense of security don't necessarily feel able to do that. So possibly some of these people have already been on a journey that you maybe haven't even realised they've been on that enables them to move forward. Thank you. Nick.
Hi Fiona, yeah, this is really interesting. Thinking about work I've done in the past with AHPs, I've done like lots with OTs and physios in particular. And one of the things that comes across with them is that in the community, they feel a lot more respected as a professional group, either OTs or physios, and feel that they can contribute more to the MDT. Whereas in the acute, they don't feel like they have that kind of professional respect that comes in, especially OTs. It feels like that they are asked questions or brought in because people have to, rather than because of what they've got to offer. And I think it's quite difficult for them because we want them. Part of the idea is that they have to be within the ward MDT team and be a part of that, as well as being part of their OT team. And when they're part of the OT team, they feel very secure. But when it comes to part of being the ward MDT team, they don't feel as though they've got that respect or that professional respect, I suppose, for what they do.
That's really interesting because it's actually something I'm going to bring out. So that's exactly what I found in my research. And that's part of what I'm going to hopefully try and bring it you to when you look at the leadership challenge is how do we enable people to feel secure? How do we create that understanding and that respect so that people understand why we have the different roles that we have? It's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to hear you say that because it's exactly what I found when I did my research as well. So that's what I'm going to try and get us to is sort of what can we do as leaders to support teams to try and minimise that really. Is it Amanda?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking it's really interesting from so from a sort of council perspective, thinking of us, a lot of the staff that we work with don't have the specific title of nurse or doctor or whatever they might be. So I suppose their professional identity is strongly linked with their individual roles and where they've built up those careers in those specific directorates or departments. So actually, when you come to something like a restructure, it can really shake what your vision of your own professional identity is going to be, because obviously that structured role that you've had for so long that you'll strongly link yourself to will maybe changed or might not be there, or you know, so it's about I suppose maybe the thought is, do we actually look at it as in thinking about people's transferable skills and trying to identify more with what those wider sort of skills are that you've got in your team, or how you identify and link yourself with that other than your specific role. So it's really interesting in how you can actually support people moving forward to recognise that. So it makes you think maybe we need to think a bit of a step behind what we usually do, you know, where we focus on the roles and the person at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you know, it's different for every team. And I think, you know, it depends on the teams that you're working with. Apologies, my team's just doing something funny this end. It depends on the teams that you're working with as to you know, how you respond to those teams and what they're doing. So for example, if you're looking at a very kind of lineated professions, like Nick was saying, like, you know, OTs working into an MT in the community, sometimes that can be possibly slightly easier because you kind of know the box that they've come out of or they want to go back into. But when you've got people that have built up careers on a much more kind of elongated route, depending on who they've worked with, and you then start to look at their structures, it's very much about kind of spending that time with the staff and understanding what they need for their professional identity, what do they need to nurture and maintain it, and how do you then provide that. Yeah, absolutely. So is it Sarah?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm just sitting here reflecting on, you know, the role of, or the profession of organisational development actually, and you know, the implications that, you know, this has for us in terms of being able to explain what we do. There's lots of different kind of roles that have an organisational development potentially aspect to it. And I know certainly within the council as well, in terms of trying to explain what we do or raise our profile within the organisation, has actually been quite difficult because people don't really understand what OD is. So I think, you know, as a profession of organisational development practitioners, we've got a role to play really in terms of trying to explain that better, to raise our profiles within our organisations, because it always seems a little bit like an uphill struggle, you know, to do that. So yeah, just really interesting to kind of reflect on that and, you know, ourselves as OD practitioners.
Yeah, and I've had that conversation with another OD practitioner, exactly that actually, to say that, you know, it can be quite difficult for you sometimes to kind of say, well, you know, who am I and what do I do, and you know, you may understand between yourselves partly because of that shared knowledge, but actually do other people recognize that? And I think that's part of what the issue can be at times, is actually that feeling of defensiveness and that feeling of insecurity it's not about yourself. It's about how you think others perceive you or others understand you. And when you feel like your role's not being recognized, how does that then, you know, how do you internalize that, and how does that make you feel? I'm trying to share the slides here, but for some is it sharing your end? No, sorry, I'm going to try and do it through a different route. Apologies. Just bear with. I'm going to see if I can share it through a slideshow here. It just means I won't be able to see what's happening in the background. Apologies about that. Sorry, this is not great, is it? This is when you want your teams to work properly and it doesn't. Can you see that now? Is that sharing with you? Can you see those slides?
Yes.
Superb, brilliant, thank you. So what I'm going to take you on to now is talk about group categorization. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard of social identity theory. I don't know if that's something that anyone's ever come across. Apologies, my Teams view is really poor now, so I can only see one person up on there. So please do just unmute your mic and shout out, because it'll be easiest unless Ashley can organise and in the background. Apologies. But what I want to talk to you about is group categorization. And I think this is really interesting because it helps us kind of understand why we behave in the way that we do, and why we identify in the groups that we do, what the kind of process that we do. So we know that self's really socially constructed. We know that we're really, relationships and processes between people is really important to us. And we have this thing called the in-group and the out-group. Now, it sounds very kind of very black and white. It sounds very binary, but actually it's much more than that. So if we look at this process here, I don't know if this is something anyone's familiar with, but if we sort of start at the top, we have our personal identity, which is very much about how we as people identify individually. And that can obviously be on so many different levels for lots of different people. So, it can be very much about, it might be about how you feel you look. It might be about who you are as a person. It might be around your nationality, your gender, all sorts of things that you may or may not identify as. And that's a very individual, personal thing as to how we feel about ourselves. But then actually that definition of self, we then slot into something called a social identity. And that is about how we then identify with other people. So, through the things that we do and the kind of interconnections that we make in our personal and professional life, we then interconnect with different groups. And we do it without realizing it. Sometimes you stop and you think and you realize you're doing it. Other times it just happens on a day-to-day basis and we don't even really think much about it because it's what we do. But what we actually do without realizing it is we're doing something called social categorization. So we are identifying distinct social groups by which we recognize the them and the us effectively. So the us, the we, the in-group is the people that are the same as us. They're the people that we recognise to have similar values. They may go to the same, it might be something really formalised like the same church or the same club or the same group that you attend or the same profession, or it may be slightly less clear than that. But it's the people that we recognise to be very similar to ourselves. So in a professional setting, like I said, if you come from a profession that's very well recognised and very kind of, very clear, like a nurse or an OT or a social worker or whatever it might be, it's kind of easy sometimes to see who the us is. However, if you come from an OD background or you come from a different background where actually maybe others don't recognise your group, it can be slightly different what your in-group and your out-group is. But effectively what we're doing in our everyday life is we're recognising the people that are similar to us. So we recognise, so for example, I recognise the people that come from a similar professional background to me. We share the same language, we have the same training. It's that kind of way of knowing. You've been in similar situations, you know what your profession does, it makes sense to you. And other people who are outside of that profession may just not understand that because they've never been through that experience. And you recognise that other people in other professions also go through that same process, but you don't necessarily understand what they're doing because you haven't been through that same journey, you haven't had that same training, you don't have that same shared language, possibly shared values. So through that we have this in-group and this out-group, and that doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be just merely a recognition of those who we are familiar with, those who make sense to us, those that we need to help us maintain and nurture our professional identity. It can be literally as simple as that, and that's a very positive thing, that's not negative. In certain circumstances, what we can end up with is it can end up becoming quite negative. So it can be a situation where if you don't feel that you've got your in-group, you don't have that familiarity, that what happens is you feel quite out of place and you're not able to maintain that self-esteem that we've just talked about, and therefore the out-group can become quite threatening to you. So I think it's just about recognizing that this is what we do, this is what we do as humans, this is what we do in groups, this is what we do in our professions, and actually through this we need to just understand that we need our in-group. I think that's the message I want to get across to you really, is that professional identity is our in-group and we need that in-group. That's really, really important to us. Before I move on, because I'm just conscious of time and there's a reason we're about to get through, and start to talk about the risks for integration, is there anything anyone wants to add in when we just look at this kind of categorization and this in-group and out-group? And I think we've kind of mentioned some of it already in the conversation we've just had. Is there anything else anyone else wants to add into that?
Joanne, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I've just had a really light bulb moment of a group of people that I'm working with at an ICB level, and they're of different professions and backgrounds to me, and that's just explained why I feel quite uncomfortable and a bit out of my depth with the group. So I see that now. Thank you.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think sometimes we have to feel quite vulnerable to recognise it and share it, actually, because we don't like to feel that we don't always feel comfortable. And I don't know about you, but feeling insecure within your work role is not something that's either I like, or B, I particularly like to admit, if I'm perfectly honest. So actually, sometimes we do have to go to quite a vulnerable place and be very self-aware to recognise that those things are happening, but they do happen. They happen a lot. So thank you. I really appreciate that. Excellent. Thank you. Ashley, you'll have to just let me know if anyone's got the hands up, but if not, we'll move on. Is that all right?
Yeah, no, nobody else, Fiona, so carry on.
Thank you. Apologies for my clunky teams. So what I want to do now is to take this on and look at integration. So what are the risks for integration? So when I talk about integration, I'm talking about multi-professional teams. So integration is a real buzzword at the moment, and we're all trying to achieve it in some shape or form, but actually what I'm talking about here is multi-professional teams. So and I think this is the interconnecting thing that's really important. So when we think about people moving into multi-professional teams, we are potentially moving and splitting up peer groups. So you think of some groups of professions that are used to working in much larger networks. So some of the more traditional professions, if you want to call them that, are used to working with a lot of their own peer. And then you start to move them into groups where it's much more multi-professional. And for example, there may be only one or two other people, or sometimes nobody else of your own professional background working in your team. What does that make you feel like? How does that, how do you nurture and maintain your professional identity then? Bearing in mind that social connection and your peer group is essential for your professional identity. How does that make you feel when you've got quite professionally isolated people? So effectively, what we've got two factors that can occur. The first is that people will try and preserve their professional identity. People really dig their heels in, really try and preserve what means something to them, and for jolly good reason. We've all gone through all sorts of journeys to create the professional identity that we have. There's a lot of learning, there's a lot of experience. Some of that's through formal learning, some of that's through our experience in the context and in the workplace. But it's very important to us, and we will try very hard to preserve that. But what can happen is people can often feel that professional identity is threatened by a multi-professional team. So that's some of the things that people have already started to mention, that in situations where people feel quite threatened, maybe they don't really understand why or what's happening, but they can feel like my professional identity is no longer nurtured. I don't feel safe any longer. My self-esteem is starting to drop. My psychological safety is starting to drop. And actually, I feel quite threatened by that team. Shouldn't be so. Then there's no one's intention for it to feel like that. But I think we just need to understand what's happening here so that we can start to then work with that. And then obviously, when you start to think about what we're trying to achieve in integration and in multi-professional teams, or we're talking about people working together, working as one team, improving patient care. If you've got a situation where people feel threatened and they're trying to preserve their own professional identity, how are we going to achieve that outcome of working together as one team? So what happens is what people do is they tend to use tactics to preserve their professional identity. So they may not realise, this is quite a subtle behaviour often, they may not realise that they're necessarily tactics, but when you start to break it down and look at it, you realise that's what they're doing. So, and these are the three things that I found really interesting in my research. And I think this is, Nick, what you alluded to earlier, is that people will, they'll want to prove what is different and unique about their profession or their professional background or their experience or their role, however you want to frame that. So there's something there about needing people to understand what I bring to this team is different. I'm here, essentially what they're saying is I'm here for a reason. Because if people don't recognise what I bring and they don't recognise that I've got this expertise or this unique knowledge or this unique experience, really they could either change my role or they could get rid of me. So I'm trying to prove what I'm bringing to this team. I'm trying to prove the value that I add to this team. And essentially what that's doing is it's trying to prove why their profession or why their role or why their expertise is needed within that multidisciplinary team. So people will often use tactics to do that. And one of the tactics, which I think is really fascinating, and you can look on this on two levels, is proving how busy they are. Now, when you look at most people in the workplace, I don't know pretty much anyone that's sitting around twiddling their thumbs. You know, the NHS and social care and all things related around it are incredibly busy, and people are genuinely busy. But what I found in my research is that people were very, very keen to prove how busy they were. Now, if you start to break that down, if you're busy, then you're needed, aren't you? So what this all comes down to is people needing to feel that they're needed within a team. What they bring to that team is needed, and they can prove why that is needed, if that makes sense to you. Does some of this start to make sense? Does any of this ring true with people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see it all the time, don't you, within the acute more than anywhere else. And I don't get there as much as I used to, but people flock to a problem, whether they can add anything to it or not, you know, whether they can give anything to the solution. There's a fire to be fought, and they will go and stand there at least and watch somebody else put it out, if nothing else.
Yeah. It's putting your two penneth worth in, isn't it? And you know, like you say, like actually when you're really busy, sometimes how keen are we to sometimes let pieces of work drop? How keen are we to say, actually, no, it's fine, someone else can do that, or that doesn't need to be done? You know, we've become very protective, don't we, and very defensive of the work that we do. And what is that about? Is that a sense of needing to feel needed, needing to feel like the value that we added is recognised? And what also, sorry.
Oh, Tyra's got her hand up there, Fiona.
Sorry, Tyra, go for it.
So it's just an observation, really. I don't know if any of the ID professionals on the call have seen the recent report around the evolution of the HR profession. And I think this really talks to that, because this is the contention between transactional HR and OD, isn't it? Because people can't get their heads around the place. So you're always the poor relative in OD. You're trying to fight your place in a HR department. For most of us, we'll sit in HR, won't we? Although it makes sense that we sit across an organisation to support the change efforts. And I think this is that we might need to do some work on this in terms of professional identity in HR, because it may well open doors for us in the work that we do moving forward. But just food for thought, really.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I don't know if anyone else wants to add into that.
I haven't got my hand up, but I'll just jump in if that's all right. I was to say that I've experienced this previously, previous just around that identity and being quite clear with the organisation about what it is we do and what our roles are and everything like that, and that actually led to a really good culture shift within kind of what the expectations were of our department and things like that. And it's just because it hadn't been clearly set out before. People just didn't understand fully what it was that we did.
This is yeah, I'm sitting and grinning because this is exactly the kind of stuff. It's really interesting seeing it come to life, and I think your stories make it give this so much more depth, because this is exactly what I'll be talking about in a moment. Actually, is about that needing to feel valued, needing to feel understood, needing other people to understand what you bring. And sometimes I think this is our role as leaders, and this is what hopefully we'll get to towards the end of this, is what was the challenge for leaders, is actually understanding what's going on, and then what are the things that we can do to facilitate this better understanding, and hopefully then a team identity. So it's really fascinating. So just stop me, Ashley, if anyone puts their hand up. But I'll just move on now to identity threats. So what can happen is people can feel really threatened in multi-professional teams. Now, obviously, a lot of this depends on how you join a multi-professional team, whether that's something that you choose to do, i.e. you apply for a job and you know that you're going to be working in a multi-professional team, and you may know that you're only of a very small number of people that are, you know, similar to you. Or sometimes, and you know, that can have impact on us, but also I think when you start to think about teams that get moved against their will, so you know, massive GPs, big reorganisations, we're all familiar with them, aren't we? We've all been through them at some point or other, and it's like kind of, I didn't choose to work in that team. I really liked working in the team I was in before, where I was surrounded by people that were all exactly the same as me or very similar and understood me, and now I'm being forced into this new team where suddenly I look around and there's a lot of people that come from a very different background, and they don't have that shared knowledge and understanding and experience and values that I have, or I don't feel that they do anyway. So that's one of the threats that is really a difficult one to get over, but I think it's about understanding the role of identity within that threat, because obviously it's much more complex than just this. But essentially it's about that lack of professional peers, it's that lack of familiarity, and then it's a reduced security. And then there's something else which I think links into the comment that was made earlier about the role of professional bodies. So there's a term called creeping genericism, which I really like, because the more I read about it, the more it makes sense. So this is all about that kind of drip, drip, drip effect. So as we get moved from one team to the next, as roles change over time, as change happens, we feel like that thing that we once had is slowly being eroded away. So for example, when you look at the kind of really traditional professions being moved into a multi-professional team, and everyone's saying, well, there's a service user or a patient, actually we don't need 3 people walking up in the community, we don't need people walking up the drive to see that patient. Actually, one person could take on the roles of a couple of others. That kind of sharing of care, and that's fine, and that can be really positive, and that can be a really good thing, but it can be perceived as this genericism. Actually, one day we're all going to end up being the same role. There's just going to be one generic health and care role. I don't know if you've ever heard that. I've heard of a few people sort of cynically say that actually I'm going to lose that specialism that I once had. I'm going to lose that role that I trained to be, that role that I went into that I wanted to be. I feel like I'm going to lose it. And in my research, someone actually said, I just worry that you're going to end up with a jack of all trades and a master of none. I mean, there was this real fear as they were moving into these integrated teams that actually they were just going to completely lose their own role, their own specialism. And this creeping genericism is a really very real threat that I think we need to consider, and we need to consider the way it makes people feel. And then as a result of that, what behaviours will ensue off the back of it. And what that creates really is a sense of insecurity. So it's exacerbated by lack of peers. You don't feel, you haven't got that maintenance of your professional identity in the way that you might want. You might not able to nurture it. People don't necessarily understand you. It may be a sense of vulnerability, a sense of lack of confidence. Sometimes, like someone said earlier, a lack of confidence in speaking out. If you're surrounded by people who have a similar background, similar knowledge, similar experience to you, it's much easier to speak out, isn't it? If you're in a group of people that have a very different background and you stick your neck out and say something, but what you're saying doesn't necessarily make sense, and then you've got to explain it and you've got to almost defend it, how much less secure do you feel? You've got to feel very secure, very confident in your role to do that. So some people are, and that's great. Not everybody is. And a lot of that can come down to, that having those peers around us, having that identification with the people that we work with. And some of that insecurity can just come from a lot of change. Change they didn't choose, feeling like their roles are going to change. I mean, this was another quote which, considering I took this 5 years ago, it's quite interesting. It says, I do truly believe that within the next 5 years, the valuable historical district nurse will disappear. Now, I'm a district nurse of background. So, and I look at these poor nurses, they just felt like the change was so much, it was so overwhelming. There was so much different stuff happening, that this was her like clinging on to this professional specialism that she had, thinking one day we're not going to have district nurses anymore. People don't realise what we do. They don't value what we do. They don't respect it. There's too much change happening. And what that then leads to is very defensive behaviour. So professional groups don't feel like the other groups fully understand them. So I think, again, this was something that we talked about earlier when we were having a conversation, weren't we? Is that, do people understand what we do? So it's interesting, in my research, what I did was I spoke to nurses, I spoke to physios and OTs, and I spoke to mental health nurses who had all been integrated into these sort of neighbourhood teams, very, very similar to the ICCs in North Cumbria. And when I spoke to all of the different professional groups, pretty much all the professional groups thought that they understood the other professional groups, but yet pretty much all of them didn't feel understood. So think about that disconnect between them thinking they understood each other, but then not actually feeling understood. Now, what I didn't do was I didn't measure whether that understanding was real or not. And to some extent, I don't think that really matters, because I think if you don't feel understood, it doesn't matter whether the other person actually understands you or not. Because if I don't feel understood, my behaviours will be very defensive, and I will have this perception that people don't value my role. They don't understand what I bring. They don't understand that expertise and that specialisms that we talked about earlier, that unique thing that I bring. If I feel that I'm not understood, I will be very defensive in the way that I behave. I feel on the back foot. You feel very insecure. So much of what we need to be thinking about when we think about these integrated teams, these multi-professional teams, or these isolated professionals, is if they don't feel understood, what can we do? How can we help them? And what is that making them? What is happening to their behaviour? Now, some of that is around the actual role that people deliver. So, for example, do people understand what the role of an OT is? Do they really understand what an OT delivers? Are they able to refer to the OT? Are they able to, recommend that an OT sees a patient effectively because they really understand their role? But some of it is a bit more subtle than that. So if you think back to the comments about how busy we are, one of the things that was really interesting in my research is that people talked about the district nurses. They bustle in and out. They're in and out of people's homes all day long. They never sit down. They barely get time for a cup of tea. And you can see they're busy. They're rushing constantly. The therapists are sat in front of a PC all day, or a lot of their day. Some of them were. They would have whole day, not all the time, but they would have whole days where they would be sitting down in front of a computer, doing referrals, doing plans, doing all sorts of work. And they would say, we're just as busy as the nurses, but because I'm sat there and I've got a cup of tea next to me, and because I'm sitting in front of my PC, it's perceived that I'm not busy and I don't feel as valued. And actually, they were just as busy and their work was just as valuable, but it wasn't as noticeable. So they didn't feel as understood. So it wasn't just literally about what they were doing. It was about their perception of how other people looked at them and what they might think about what they're doing, because they were sitting down all day. I mean, how dare they, but that was how they felt. And I don't know whether the nurses didn't necessarily say that, but that's how the therapists felt. And I think that was what was important, is because it's about how we feel. It's about our identity. It's about how we feel within the team. Sorry, my phone's going off. And then the impact that then has on our own behaviours. And then from that, what we feel is a real sense to need to protect our role. So if we feel defensive, we feel like we're not understood, we feel like the value that we bring isn't really recognised, what happens is we feel like we need to protect it. And people were really overt about that. They said, everyone's very precious about their own domain. They were really feeling like they needed to protect what they brought. And actually, then you start to think about integration. You start to think about, teams coming together, multi-professional teams, wrapping care around the patient, improving patient care. And then you've got groups of professionals who may be feeling like this. The two don't connect together, do they? There's something that we need to do to work with those teams to support them as they move forward. So I'm going to stop showing the slides for a minute and just give you a couple of seconds to think about it. And again, I'd be really interested in your comments, whether this rings true to you, and whether you're seeing any of this kind of behaviour in the teams that you're working with, or even within yourself, actually. Nick?
I'm working with, a large group of lots of different MDT. Well, it's not a multidisciplinary team, it's just lots of disciplines that unfortunately aren't yet a multidisciplinary team, even though we're working towards that. And I'm finding that the being busy bit is coming out very much in the most clinically senior people of this sort of group of folk. The people who should feel most secure about their position actually are the people who are at most pains to tell you how much stuff they have to do and how they don't have time for this and how they don't have time for that, and it's quite interesting that it's at that level, I suppose. And it is, and there is a theory behind it that I've read somewhere, that the more senior you get, the more you feel that you have to justify that. And it's quite interesting seeing these people who are basically at the top of their profession in the county, and at the top of their particular area's tree, as it were. They are absolutely desperate to be able to tell you that I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I've got this to do, I've got this to do. It's like, whoa, okay, I believe you, calm down. But that in me makes me think, hang on, why are you so desperate to tell me all this stuff? Because it's always been my sort of, I don't know, flippant experience in the past that the people who tell you how busy they are most are the people who generally aren't that busy. And I don't want to think that way. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And I think you kind of make an assumption. I suppose I did it early on in my research. I was like, oh well, the people that have most, that have had the most training, the most experience, that are kind of most established in their careers, will have a stronger professional identity. But that isn't actually the case. Isn't necessarily the case. And actually, sometimes is it that they feel that people just don't recognise and understand what their role is? Is that what's making them feel like that? I don't know. Joanne.
Some of it, I think it's almost like busy equals important, and I'm not going to be this. If I'm that busy, you can't dispose of me. Yeah. So I think there's something psychological going on. Maybe that is in this sort of economically challenged situation that we're in, and sort of again internal change. So I think that it's made me think of that busy equals importance, but also potentially for me sometimes, how do we describe our own roles? Sometimes being able to articulate our role. I think Sarah mentioned it from an OD perspective. We sometimes can't clearly say exactly what we do because we end up doing loads of different things, back to your generic sort of role. But also, I mean, we'll be working with a couple of teams that have merged, but they're of the same professions. But again, there's that jostling again for identity and role and purpose, and just sort of, we're one team, you're another, and now we've got to come together. So again, the vulnerableness starts to come out and get acted out in behaviours sometimes, because they're the same professions, but they feel like they've got to hold on to it even tighter. It's challenging. And like I say, I think it's good to discuss it, because that's when you can at least get to some self-recognition and self-awareness of maybe your own behaviours in this.
Yeah, exactly. It's about your own behaviours, isn't it? And I think it's when you're working with teams like that, it's about facilitating those conversations that help them have that self-awareness and understand what's happening, but in a non-threatening way, so you can kind of move it forward constructively. I guess that's a real challenge. But yeah, and Tyra.
So I agree that this your personal professional identity. I think that's something that Nicholas, is it Nicholas or Nick?
Oh, Nick, please, because
only
my mum calls me Nicholas, and then only when I'm in trouble.
So Nick, so something you said was really interesting for me. It's how senior people at the top are quite defensive. And there was I don't know if anybody's seen the Messenger report that recently came out about leadership in the NHS, ahead of the integration agenda on the back of Black Lives Matter and some of the stuff that we've worked on COVID. But one of the things that's interesting, there's been a backlash to that report, which is around managers in the NHS and the growth of the management role within the NHS as well. So what that means is you're not just having to deal with your own professional identity, but you're on attack as well from the outside political context. So you're having to justify your roles, you're having to think about what they mean and what value they add. And one of the things that came out recently was for our EDI colleagues, the report was saying that in the Messenger report you've mentioned that equality, diversity, inclusion is important 3 times in how we need this manager, but only once around patient care, forgetting actually that the two come hand in hand, because if you don't have inclusive organisations, you're not going to deliver inclusive care. So I think there's something about professional identity being attacked by the political agenda of the NHS that we need to be cognizant of in the environment that we work. It's not just within those clinical contexts, but what the management infrastructure that surrounds those clinical contexts, and that jostling, that positioning. And certainly I've seen a lot of that recently as well. And I see it in our OD colleagues sometimes as well, because we say, don't we, that's not mine to do, that's the EDI lead's to do, or that's that person's to do. And we're guilty of it in our own professions as well. And I think partly that is related to professional identity in the way that you've described, Fiona.
Thank you. It's really good. I mean, you're a really good group to work with because you're very self-reflective. That's really helpful, because actually what you're doing is you're listening and you're going, oh, yes, this has happened. Not everyone you work with is like that. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think actually when we're prepared to really examine ourselves, we can see the behaviour in ourselves, not just the teams we work in or what's happening wider than that. We can see we're doing it in the way in which we act ourselves, aren't we? So I'm really conscious of time, because what I want to do is I want to take you on to look at kind of the next steps, really. So is that sharing with you again? Yeah, brilliant, superb. So yeah, so we've kind of talked about what it is, the challenges, what happens within integration. But what I really want to spend a bit of time on now is just talking about moving forward and the next steps and what we can do and how we consider this. So I want to talk about something called professional identity salience. So what this is saying is that when people move into a multi-professional team, or effectively their professional identity, not that it gets diluted, but they're in a situation where they're not surrounded by people that are exactly the same as them, I guess. When that happens, what will happen is you will most likely identify with your own professional group first and foremost. So if you're in a multi-professional team, your first identification is likely to run most deepest with those that you would consider as your professional group or your role, or however you want to describe that. And I think the key thing to remember here is this is not a threat to integration. It should not be a threat, because actually what it does is it enables people to feel secure. And when they feel secure, they don't feel vulnerable, they're confident, they have a better self-esteem. And then what they can do is they can then start to identify with their multi-professional group. So they can then almost create a second identity. And that is when I believe true integration occurs. So integration as a term is bandied around all over the place, and I have a real issue with it because we talk about it on a strategic level, we talk about it on a team level. But what is really integration? And I believe it's really truly when people start to identify with their wider team, and then they start to wrap their care around their patients and their service users, and they start to consider actually this is going to improve patient care. So because they feel secure and they feel that their own professional identity is recognised and nurtured. So this is a really key concept that I want you to remember, is that actually it's important that people can identify with their own professional group. They should be able to nurture it and maintain it, and we need to consider how that can happen, because when that happens, then they can start to identify with their wider team, and that's really important. So for a positive, so when we think about what we've talked about so far, we've talked about what professional identity is, we've talked about what can happen in integration. These are the kind of key central tenets that I think maintain a positive professional identity. So we've already covered a lot of this. This is about feeling valued. It's about feeling recognised. People know what my role is. They understand my role, and I'm here for a reason. And they, whoever the they is, I mean, I use the term, don't I? They recognise me and they realise why I'm here. So I feel secure in that. I feel that they recognise my expertise, my specialisms, that unique contribution that I bring to the team, but my profession gives me and I bring to you lot. You recognise it, you understand it, you value it, and then I feel secure. And then from then I can then move on, and I can start to learn, I can start to mix, I'm start to interest in actually expanding my role and thinking, actually I could learn something from someone else. I could start to expand what I'm doing because I feel very secure and my professional identity is positive, and that bolsters my self-esteem. I feel good about myself within my role, and then actually I fulfill my role so much better because of that. So these are like the key elements that we need to remember from a positive professional identity. And we could start to break these down and think about these even further, but I'm just going to leave them with you, and then I'm going to show you something else. So this is a balance. So I think this is the challenge for leaders and for ourselves, but I think, you know, we have, as leaders in the system, people have the opportunity then to think about, okay, what can I do to make a difference effectively? So what you're looking at is you're looking at this balance between, do people feel more valued than they feel threatened? And this is the thing that we need to be aware of. So I don't think those threats necessarily will ever disappear completely, but what it's about doing is minimizing them and making sure that the feeling valued side is much stronger. So that feeling valued side is about, you know, your peer support that we've talked about. There's people that are similar to you that help you maintain and nurture your professional identity. It's about your unique contribution and your specialisms and expertise being recognised. People realise why you're there. They realise what your role brings, and they want you in the team. So there's a real need for you within the team. On the flip side, you're looking at these two threats. So the one is around distinctiveness threat. So it's about a threat to that thing about you which is distinctive, which is like almost the opposite of the other side, isn't it? So it's that distinct, that unique contribution. If you feel that that's threatened in some way, or you feel that people don't recognise your specialisms and their expertise, you feel a distinctiveness threat. You feel that that distinct core element to you is under threat in some way. And it's about that creeping genericism. So if people feel like their role is being eroded because people don't realise what they do, or they're changing them at such a rate or in such a way that it doesn't feel comfortable any longer, the balance starts to tip, and then actually it's no longer a positive professional identity, it's actually quite an uncertain one, or it can start to feel quite negative. And if we think right back to the beginning about what identity is and why we need a professional identity, and it's about our self-esteem, it's about our well-being, it's about our confidence within our role, it's really important that we look at this balance and we look at individuals and teams and think, are they feeling more valued within their professional identity, within this mixed professional team? Are they feeling more valued than they are threatened? Yeah, does this make sense? And I think these, there's lots of elements to this that we can start to break down, but this is effectively the balance that we're trying to maintain. So if I'm assuming no one's putting their hands up, so just please do shout out, Ashley, if they do, because I'm, and if you want to, please do as well. Don't wait for me to stop. But if this balance is right, and people feel more valued than they feel threatened, and they feel like people, they've got that support, they can maintain and they can nurture their professional identity, and they're understood and they're recognised, what they can start to do is to move forward to something called mobilisation of their identity. And I think this is the really key important thing that we need to remember, and this is what we're trying to aim towards. So if you look at the big blue circle, like my highly scientific diagram here, the big blue circle of your professional identity, that's your own professional identity, which in the vast majority of cases will be most important to you. That should remain, and we should not be threatened by that. We should nurture it, we should enable it, we should facilitate it. As leaders, we should remember that that is really, really important. These people are brought into these roles for a reason. We need them, we need the skills, we need the value, we need to value what they bring, we need to look at their experience. Everything that their journey so far has brought to them is very important to us, and we need to recognise that, and we need to ensure that they can nurture and maintain that. But then what we can then start to do, and this is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to move them forward so they form a second identity. It will probably always form second place to their main profession, but that's your group identity. And that's when you start to look at your wider team and they become an us. They're no longer the out group. The OTs that work in my team are no longer the out group. They're part of my in group. It's a different in group to my nursing in group, but that's fine. That's okay, because I consider them also to be my in group. There's a shared experience, there's shared values, there's an understanding. I feel safe, I feel they understand me, I think they feel like I understand them. We recognise the expertise and the unique contribution that we each bring, and from that actually we're starting to identify together, and we start to create a group identity. And I think what we realise is that professional identity does morph and it does change through experience and through context, and that's fine, but it's about doing it in a positive and a secure and a valued way. So we know as we move through our professional journey, we need to withstand changes, we need to withstand what's happening in our professional environment, and we need to adapt to that. But what's really, really important is that we have that, like it says here, the strong and confident professional identity, which is linked to staff wellbeing, it's linked to good clinical practice and patient care. But we need to enable that. So this is effectively what we're looking at as leaders, is how can we support staff to have this strong professional identity within their own profession, but then also create this second identity with their wider group. And that's effectively what we're looking at. So even though there's all the challenges that we've talked about and there's all the threats that can happen, actually this is the place we're trying to move them to. We're trying to move them to a place where they feel secure within their own professional identity, so that they can then create their second identity with their wider team. And so much of the other work that you're doing as OD practitioners is going to be doing so much more to this. This is kind of like a wider framework, I guess, but it's just kind of putting professional identity in the context of that. Does that also kind of ring true? I'm seeing a few nods. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to add anything into that. Joanne.
I was going to apologise for being vocal, but I'm not. I just can't help it today, because it's hitting so many points, and I'm about to plan this intervention with, like I said, two teams that are coming together. So I think that valued and threatened is so interesting, to mobilise them to become an us. and probably not talk as technical as yourself, but to bring those sort of theories into play. I think that's really useful for them to help to understand why they're feeling insecure and threatened. They're of the same profession, so you know what they do is fantastic work, so it's pulling that together. So I think it's really hitting a note for me, and it's quite timely because I've got to plan this intervention tomorrow.
Oh, fantastic. I'm really glad it's helpful. Brilliant. Amanda.
Yeah, I was just thinking it's really interesting because from an OD perspective, it kind of makes you think about how a lot of the time we're sort of starting halfway through the picture, and it's about sort of taking people back to the very beginning. So especially when you've got more generic roles, because we've got a lot of jobs, obviously you do it for equality, you've got job families, role descriptions are sort of, you know, very sort of similar for a lot of different roles. So it's helping people go back to the beginning and pick out their own unique characteristics, which we're not used to doing at the moment. So really it's kind of starting from scratch with some people to look at what are your unique characteristics, what are the core elements that you bring to the team, not just what it says on your generic job description, but what is it about you personally, you know, that helps you have your own professional identity. And then it's helping them to grow and develop that, isn't it? So that, like you say, they've then got the confidence to feel secure in their own core elements, that they can grow and develop them to move forward in the organisation wherever they find themselves. So yeah, no, it's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're right, because it's not just literally you go to, for example, you go to university and you do a course and you come out and you qualify and you go and do a role. It's about that. It's the socialization. It's those experiences that you've had, like you say. And then actually, when you start to look at it individually, like, where have I been? What is my journey? What specialisms have I got? What unique things do I bring? And maybe that's the kind of thing that's happening with the two teams that you were talking about, with the come from the same profession, is that they may have the same label, but they'll have all had very different journeys, and they'll have all picked up very different expertise along the way. And you know, they'll come from different places. They'll have moved into the role in which they're in. What have they learned? Do they feel that they're able? Is that recognised? Do they feel that they're able to share that, or do they just feel that actually that's a little bit overlooked and people don't realise what it is they bring to it? So, whilst it's absolutely about a wider group, and you need that support, there's also your very own personal journey into that wider group, isn't it? So it's about, you know, helping people feel secure within that, so that they can then start to look wider than that and start to look at that mobilised identity with your wider team in which you work. So I'm just going to go to the last little bit, if that's okay, and talk about how is that presenting for you? Yep.
Yeah, we've got it.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So what I want to look at, I guess, is leadership. You know, what do we do? How can we facilitate? How can we support? What are the things we need to consider in what I call a mobilised world? Because that's what we want to get to. We want to get to the point where people can move beyond their own professional identity with the profession or the role or the network that they feel safe with, and start to look wider into that multi-role, that multi-professional world, because that's what we work in. And that's ultimately the aim of what integration is, isn't it? It's about lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds coming together, but wrapping the care around the patient or the service user in the middle. So what can we do as leaders, and how can we facilitate that, and how can we help teams facilitate that? So there's, in no particular order really, there's lots of different things around the outside here that are very practical when we start to look at what we've already talked about. So I think what's really important is about professional peer support. So I think it's about questioning who are the people within a team that you might be referring to, or yourself. Is that professional peer support there, and how is it? Is it supported? Is it is it ring-fenced time? Are you sure that that person has the professional peer support that they need? Especially when you start to look at teams where you've got very isolated professionals. You know, how are they linking into their wider professional group? Now, some of that is about clinical practice, isn't it? It's about safe clinical practice and making sure that they have that opportunity to be not only peer reviewed, but to be supported within what they're doing clinically. But some of that is about that knowing and those values that you share, and that safe place to be. So what is the professional peer network? Does it exist? And if it doesn't, how can you enable that? What can you do to support it? I think it's about recognising and celebrating each other's identities. I think almost like the elephant in the room here is we have to recognise that even on this group now, we will all have different identities. Some of you will share much more together than I possibly will join into, and you will recognise things about each other. Some of us won't. Some of us will quite different because we've had very different professional journeys. But it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying, actually, we have difference, because that's about recognizing what's different about ourselves. It's about recognizing that uniqueness, and then from that we then feel valued. So it's almost been quite overt. So rather than saying, oh, integration, they're all in one team, they all need to be one team. Yes, they do. But to get there, we also need to recognize the different things that we bring, because if we recognize that difference, people won't be defensive, they won't be insecure, they'll let their barriers down, and actually they'll then start to integrate properly. And part of that is about improving understanding, like we've talked about, and you need to maybe consider like what is the facilitation is needed to improve that understanding. Not just literally about going through the job description and saying an OT does this and a nurse does that, but it's about that kind of understanding as to how they do it. So that, like that example that I brought about, the therapist sitting behind a PC all day long, having a whole day sitting there doing, working at a computer. Well, of course they're not working if they're sitting at a computer. That was the perception that they had. I don't think other people felt like that. But how do you improve that understanding so that people realise what it is that each of the roles do, and they then feel safe and secure because their role is recognised? It's about team activities. The more teams it kind of seems fairly simple, doesn't it? But the more teams integrate, the more teams work together, the more things they do together across the professional groups, the more that identity will start to form. And it's about communities of practice. So the communities of practice is very closely linked, obviously, to the professional peer support, isn't it? Some of it's around a very kind of clinically or practice or kind of care delivery level, but some of it's about just a network, a support network, a safe place to be. I think there's something about acknowledging differences. So in the same way as we need to recognise each other's identities, we need to also recognise differences, because then that helps to counteract the threat of creeping genericism. It's about recognising there's lots of things we share, but there's lots of things that we bring that are different, and that's why we're all together, because we need our different expertise. And then it's about developing safety and trust. So then as people feel safe, they feel they're recognised, they feel they're valued, they feel they're understood, they have that safe place to go to with their peers, then that psychological safety at work starts to come in. They feel that there's trust. And then you're starting to look at a professional identity across professions within a team, where actually we're all together, we recognise, we value what each other bring, and then we can start to create that team identity. So I guess in summary, what that's about is recognising, acknowledging, celebrating professional identities, and making sure that there is space for those identities to be nurtured. Don't just assume them, don't just recognise them and leave them at that, but just remember that identities, they change. They need to be nurtured, they need to be maintained. Recognise and celebrate the differences in each profession, and create a team where each profession feels that unique contribution is recognised and needed, and then foster that sense of security for each of the professions. Because if you do that, then they're not going to be feeling like they need to prove why they're there. They're not going to need to prove their worth within the team. It's about facilitating, like I said, the improved understanding of each role so that they feel understood. So it's not just about thinking, each profession understand each other? It's about, does each profession feel understood? Because then the defensiveness will be reduced and there'll be a sense of security for each profession. And it's about that opportunity for the professional groups to support each other. And then you can start to move on to things like team activities, because then actually people feel secure, they don't feel defensive, they feel valued. That sort of threat and value balance starts to tip in the way of feeling valued. It's then about your positive self-esteem, it's about your confidence within your role, and then people can feel like actually they're less vulnerable, or it's okay to be vulnerable, but I can start to identify with my wider team. But all of those elements that we've talked about until now need to be put into place. They need to be understood and recognised and addressed to move to that point where you start to create a team identity. So often what we do is we create new teams, don't we? And then we say, right, okay, what's the aims and objectives of this team? What's this team about to deliver? What do we want as a team? What is our shared values? But we haven't addressed any of the other things that come up to it. Unless often that's what will happen, isn't it? So we'll often not look at all those building blocks that we need to consider before we can move on to a team identity, because actually I truly believe that you can only create a team identity when people feel secure and they feel that their own professional identity is safe and secure. So I guess these are the key things I want you to remember, really, is that professional identity is very social, it needs maintenance, it impacts our self-esteem, which is so important. I think that integration can very negatively affect professional identity, but I also think that as a result, professional identity can very negatively impact integration. So if we're trying to move things forward, we're trying to improve patient care, we're trying to achieve these integrated multi-professional teams, we must address professional identity. People will identify with their professional group first and foremost, but that's absolutely fine, and that's a good thing, because it's only then that they can then start to move forward and identify with their team. And I believe it's only then that true integration really happens. And I think the challenge for us all as leaders, and with whichever role we are a leader, is to facilitate that and to support staff to maintain their own professional leadnesses, their own professional familiarity, so that they feel safe, and they can then start to identify with their team. So yes, thank you. That's pretty much the end of it. I see that, sorry, Tyra's got a hand up, and apologies if I've talked over you, Tyra.
No, not at all. It's just a question I've got, Fiona, for you in the research that you've done. Did you do any work around the shifting of professional identities? Because I'm looking at the role of pharmacists and what they did in medicines management 25 years ago, and now how they're managing minor ailment clinics at the front end of general practice. So actually professional identity, so what I've come across are professionals like, across nurses, mental health nurses, paramedics, pharmacists. They're moving into different spheres of practice, just because as we move from treatment into management of long-term disease and population health, we have to think about professions in a slightly different way. And those that have been taught through universities have to think about the way that they work in a different way as well. So whilst people are bringing their professional identities and we're working around that integration, the professions themselves are changing because the nature of the work is changing. So have you done any work in your research around what the starting point might be for integration? Because you're not just thinking about bringing established roles together, then those roles themselves are evolving, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't so much look at the kind of evolution that's happening now, which I agree with you, it's changing so much on so many levels. But I think what I did start to look at is actually almost like the historical position of where some of these professions came from, and then you start to think about, okay, why do certain professions act in certain ways? So for example, if you take the really kind of like the well-known kind of I don't know how to put it really, but the kind of the differences between, for example, medicine and some like therapy and nursing and some of those, and where they came from, and you start to look at like even the way society views those professions. And then you start to think, oh, why are some professions more defensive than others? And you think, actually, look at the journey that they've had even to get any kind of recognition. And I guess this is a little bit like I'm hearing from some of you guys around your OD networks. It's like, do you really feel like the world recognises what you do? If you come from a very well-known profession, whether people understand you correctly or not, there's a certain understanding in society about what your role is. But I think for some of you, it's a much more difficult journey. So I think you've even got that to consider. But then when you, like you're saying, Tyra, like more recently, when you start to look at the way roles are evolving, so nurses and therapists and paramedics, etc., moving into advanced practice, for example, how do those people feel within that role? I mean, there's so much more to be done, Tyra. I think the thing is, when you do a PhD, is that you kind of end up going down an avenue, and then you realise there's like a million different places that you could go in. But really, I think it is really fascinating. Yeah. And I think that really impacts about, some professions do appear to be more defensive than others. I mean, I think you look at the classic of doctors, there tends to be a huge amount more confidence within medicine than possibly some of the other roles. And you think, well, why is that? Is that something to do with the way that society views them? And then you think about doctors giving up, if you want to call it that, some of the roles to, nurses and therapists, etc. How do they feel about that? And that exchange of tasks, if you want to break it down to that. I mean, there's so much to consider about some of the behaviours that we see, isn't there? And why people feel like they do. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I really appreciate your time coming to listen, and I hope it was really helpful. And I'm very, very happy to have further conversations with anyone about any of this stuff, really, because I've just kind of given you a high level overview. In the slides, I've also put some papers on the end that might be interesting. Some of them are research papers, but a couple of them are actually just kind of like academy papers that are really fascinating and quite easy and accessible to read. That will just give you a bit more background to this stuff. But like I say, feel free to contact me if there's anything anyone wants to discuss further.